So our second part of talking about cameras is just going to be talking about depth of field. And depth of field is a term taken from photography that has to do with how much of a field of view is in focus. So the default for Blender, if you create a scene like the one I created with an object in the foreground, an object in the middle ground, and an object in the background, they're all equally in focus. This would be considered an infinitely deep depth of field. We've got something very far away, and part of what creates realism, or the sense of realism that we've been accustomed to, is having some sense of depth of field, that you've got a focal point of an object and you've got things kind of fading off and becoming blurry as they get farther away, or the opposite. You could certainly focus on the distance and the foreground could be blurry. So we'll play around with both of those. So in this scene, if I get out of this view, just to give you some perspective here, let's look at solid view. So I've got the camera set up here, focused very close onto a sphere, and we've got two objects that are quite a distance away. All right. So I go back into that view, and let's go into rendered view. So we have this light, this soft light, three lights actually on these objects, and I just rendered a view, and you saw everything was in focus. Okay, so with the camera selected that's active, and in this case it's this camera here, it's very simple. In the camera properties, click on the green camera properties and just enable depth of field. So once you enable depth of field, you get some options. First of all, you've got the option to focus the camera on an object in the scene. And the second would be focus by distance. And I'm going to show you how to do both of those things. So focusing on an object in the scene is very convenient, but just be warned that what it's doing is it's focusing on wherever the center of the volume of that object is. So it will be focusing on the center of the sphere. So if this was a person, you might want to focus on the front of their face, not the center of their skull. So let's try that though, for instance. So let's go ahead and just step by step. I'm going to click this this window here, and I'm going to tell it to focus on the sphere. Okay, so it's now focused on the center of the sphere, which is fine. And when you do that, it disables the distance menu. And when you disable that, so once that's disabled, it's grayed out, and even if you changed it, it's not doing anything. So just kind of ignore that. Now, the things that create the quality of depth of field are the f-stop. We'll briefly talk about this, blades and rotation, although it's really subtle and not so interesting, and ratio. F-stop and ratio are the two main things. So an f-stop is a number that's going to determine how much depth of field there is in a scene. So by default, with an infinite depth of field, this number would be very high. Okay, so in photography, for instance, like an f-stop of 32 or 64 would be quite a large f-stop. And if you click on that and you render the scene, it's going to look probably very similar. Everything is in focus for sure, right? Okay, so the way to start to actually see these effects is to really exaggerate the f-stop. So let's do that. Let's change it to 1.2. So I've got a very shallow depth of field, and you can see it in the preview already where it's focused on the foreground and the background is blurry. So let's go ahead and render that just as it is. And there we have a really nice change of the depth of field. The objects in the background start to get blurry. The object in the foreground is nice and sharp, right? So even if you zoom in here, you can start to see, right? It's very, very good. All right. So the ratio default sets to 1, and it says distortion to simulate anamorphic lens bokeh. So what I would say is that you can play with it, and if you make it a very low number, say make it 0, ooh, that's a little too low, or almost doesn't let you go to 0. If you make it, you know, 0.2 or something like that, what happens is it looks almost like the things in the background are not just becoming out of focus naturally, they're sort of exaggerated, almost like there's motion blur, like it's blurring from left to right. And if you do a higher number, you get, you know, less of that. So I'm going to set this back to 1, maybe a little lower, 0.8, just to exaggerate. Okay. So let's put this f-stop to, I don't know, 4. Now at 4, we might start to see some. Let's render it and see if we can tell by zooming in. Likely gonna, yeah. So I zoom in here, and now you see that, in fact, yeah, definitely it's blurrier in the background than it was in the foreground. Yeah, but it's more subtle than before. So for purposes of this, we're going to really exaggerate things so we can see the differences. So we focused on the sphere. Fine, let's start by just taking this step by step, and let's change it. And now let's focus on the torus. And if I focus on the torus and render it, the focal point is here, and probably because that Suzanne head is not too much further behind it, it's a little blurry and a little low res, but the torus, is the focal point, and for sure the sphere is blurry in the foreground. So you start to get the idea pretty quickly. It's fairly intuitive how this works. And then lastly, I can focus on Suzanne. And if I make this, let's just really crank this down there. Let's make a super, super shallow depth of field and even drag this ratio down. That's pretty nice. And then focus on the Suzanne head. And we've got this totally blurry object in the foreground, and the torus is sort of mildly out of focus. So that's pretty great. Okay, now we'll play around with, instead of focusing on objects, we'll focus by distance. And this is pretty neat because it allows you to be incredibly precise about where you're focusing. So we're gonna well, let's leave it exactly where it is. It's focused way back there at Suzanne, and we're gonna play around with focusing at a really shallow depth of field on the front part of the sphere and the middle part of the sphere and the back part of the sphere. So right now it's not even close. So in order to do this, we're gonna click the little X next to the focus object. So now it's not focusing anymore. Now it's focused by distance again. So this becomes more active, and you could actually just by hand, you know, kind of experiment with, well, I don't know what the distance is, and you can certainly, as you get closer, we're going to start to focus on the ball. Right now we're focused at the front of the ball or somewhere on the ball. So that's not very precise. It gives you an idea, but you have to just play around with it. You can get incredibly precise, and to do that, you're going to open up the tab right above depth of field called Viewport Display, and you're going to just check this, very simply check this box called Limits. And we're going to move out of this camera view, and I'm also just going to go into solid mode so we can really clearly see this. Get out of rendering mode. Yeah, okay. So when you check limits, you get this crosshairs, this yellow crosshairs, and this line projecting from the camera. And what this is telling you is that you've got this crosshairs, and it is the focal point. That's the focal point. That is 7.5 meters right now. So if you try to click it and grab it, well, that doesn't work because you're grabbing the whole camera. So you don't want to do that. But what you can do is you can, let's say, kind of scroll around. Actually, you can get really precise. You could go into this side view here. It's by hitting 3 on your keyboard. Yeah, that's really great. So I've got this side view, and right now you can see that 7.5 meters is at the back end of the ball. So if you just start to scroll in the distance menu here, or you can hit the little arrows, you can actually just start to drag this, and you could tell it that basically I'm going to focus right at the front plane of this ball, the sphere right here. So if I hit 0 on my keyboard, and you notice that none of the depth of field shows up when you're in solid mode. Wow, material preview does show up, but it looks crazy. Rendered mode will give you the best way of looking at this. So let's see what's happening here. We've got this pretty exaggerated. Let's make our f-stop 1.2. All right. So we've got this focal point at the very front tip of the ball. And if I render the scene, it's going to render it with that in focus. So with a ball that's, you know, like that, with an object like this, it's very uniform. It's sort of hard to tell exactly, but you do see that it's focused right there. And with a shallow enough depth of field, you're going to see it actually get less focused as you move to the back of the ball. So let's see if we can actually exaggerate that a bit. Let's say 0.5 or 0.2. See what happens here and render it. Yeah, so obviously everything behind it is blown out, but what we see here is that it's definitely focused at that point, and then it gets blurry even as you get to the back of the ball. So let's look at this. So I'm gonna go back to this distance thing. We've still got our limits showing, and I'm going to go back into my side view. I'm gonna go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and move this toward the back of the ball. So now I've got the distance set to 6.1. I'm going to just drag this longer until it's toward the back end of the ball. Now go back to my camera view, and sure enough, the front of the ball is out of focus now. And if there was a nice thing to focus on in the back of the ball, it would be perfectly in focus. So that's how you focus by distance. So let's try it one more time with focusing, just to make it really obvious. Let's focus it on the distance of one of those other objects. So I'm gonna drag this way back. I'm gonna say by distance, let's say 25, where that puts us. No, even farther, 35. Yeah, it's getting there. So let's say right around there. Looks like it's lined up with the distance of the torus. And hit 0 on my keyboard, and you could certainly fine-tune this now if you could see it, that the torus is pretty focused, and we can render it. Pretty neat. Last thing, that looks great. So last thing you want to I'll just mention is this thing about blades and rotation. This has to do with the kind of style of bokeh, which is a kind of what happens when a real camera lens has distortion or has a focus, an out of focus area. You get this effect called bokeh. So different lenses have different effects, and honestly, I have not seen much of a difference. You can play with it yourself. Maybe there's some slight differences you'll see, but I haven't been able to. All right, so that is oh yeah, so see, in material preview should work too, by the way, to preview the effects. But that is how to use depth of field in Blender.